The smoke is so thick it tastes like copper and burnt sulfur. It is July 3rd, 1863. Colonel Edward Porter Alexander stands on a ridge in Pennsylvania, his ears ringing with the relentless, rhythmic thunder of 150 cannons. He is the master of this fire. He is the man tasked with shattering the Union line. But as he peers through his glass at the impossible distance, his stomach turns. He sees the target, he sees the stone wall, and he sees that his fire is missing its mark. It is overshooting. The most powerful artillery barrage in the history of the Western Hemisphere is doing nothing but tearing up the dirt behind the enemy. He realizes with a cold, absolute clarity that he is about to send 12,000 men to their deaths for nothing. In 50 minutes, it would be over. 6,000 of them would be dead, wounded, or captured. History books call this the turning point of the American Civil War. They talk about courage, about high watermarks, about the bravery of the charge. They left out the incompetence, the silence, and the man who stood in the center of the storm and saw the tragedy unfolding long before the first man stepped off. Edward Porter Alexander was not a man of high-flown rhetoric or Southern romanticism. He was a scientist of war. Born in Washington, Georgia, Edward Porter Alexander was a man whose intellect seemed to operate at a higher frequency than his peers. At West Point, he was a standout student, a star man whose aptitude for engineering and mathematics was legendary, consistently placing him at the very top of his class. Those who served alongside him often described him as exceptionally serious, possessing a quiet, almost intimidating mental acuity that made him seem older than his years, a man who viewed the chaos of the world through the objective, stabilizing lens of a mathematician. At 28, he was a man of cold, hard logic, a graduate of West Point who believed that battle was a calculation, a series of inputs and outputs. He was the chief of artillery for Longstreet's Corps, a man who measured victory in trajectories and ammunition counts. He was a small man with a keen eye, the kind of person who noticed when a cog in the machine was missing, even when everyone else was cheering for the engine to run. He was an observer, and he was, by the end of this day, a man who had seen the foundation of his world crumble beneath the weight of pride. The stakes at Gettysburg were not merely territorial, they were the deciding factor for the Confederacy's existence. Lee's army had marched into Pennsylvania with a clear objective: to bring the war to the Union's doorstep and force a political surrender. A Confederate victory on Northern soil would have shattered the morale of the North, potentially forcing the Lincoln administration to the negotiating table under the shadow of a direct threat to Washington, D.C. More importantly, it was the best and perhaps final chance to secure formal recognition from Great Britain and France. If the South could prove they were a sovereign power capable of defeating the Union on their own turf, foreign intervention could have changed everything. The entire war hinged on whether Lee could make the North realize that the cost of continuing the conflict was higher than the cost of letting the South go. The trouble had started long before the smoke cleared. It began with a silence that cost the Confederacy its eyes. J.E.B. Stuart, the flamboyant cavalry commander, had ridden off on a raid, vanishing into the landscape. He left Robert E. Lee functionally blind. Without the cavalry to scout the Union movements, the Confederate army was moving in the dark. Alexander would later write with icy precision that this wasn't just a mistake, it was a violation of the fundamental principles of warfare. You do not march into a void. You do not fight without knowing what lies on the other side of the hill. This lack of intelligence forced the Confederate commanders to navigate the rolling Pennsylvania landscape like men trapped in a windowless room. Every order issued during those days became a desperate gamble. A crossroads, a ridge, or a cluster of trees could hide either a few weary scouts or an entire Union corps waiting in ambush. Rumors replaced reconnaissance, and the high command grew erratic, paralyzed by the gnawing anxiety of the unknown. Alexander watched as seasoned officers were reduced to guessing, their confidence eroding with every hour that passed without a reliable report. forcing the army to stumble into a deadly, high-stakes game of blind man's bluff against an opponent who held every advantage of position. The collision on the first day was supposed to be a minor affair. A brigade of Confederate infantry needed shoes, a simple logistical necessity. Instead, they stumbled into Union cavalry, and the friction ignited a firestorm. By the time the dust settled, Heth and Pend had fed 12,000 men into a grinder occupied by 23,000 Union troops. 2 entire brigades were effectively destroyed over what Alexander dismissed as a side issue. The machine was breaking down, and the commanders were only just beginning to grasp the scale of the error. Then came the second day. The logical move was clear: pull back, take a defensive position, and let the Union army break themselves against the Confederate lines. Alexander calculated that there was no logistical reason to attack. He firmly believed the Confederates threw away 60% of their chances for victory by choosing to remain on the offensive. He wrote, "I think it must be frankly admitted that there was no real difficulty whatever in our taking the defensive the next day. But the appetite for a decisive blow was too great. The command staff remained committed to the offensive, ignoring the mounting evidence that the momentum had shifted. The Union had claimed the high ground, and in warfare, that is not just an advantage, it is a force multiplier. Alexander estimated that the Union position on Cemetery Hill added 50% to their effective fighting strength. They were dug in, they were reinforced, and they were waiting. The Confederate command did almost no reconnaissance of these positions overnight. They simply assumed they could overwhelm them. Alexander noted with a biting edge that it was pity for Meade how easy Confederate mistakes had made for the Union commander. And then the chaos of the artillery. Alexander was the man in charge of the bombardment meant to soften the Union line for Pickett's charge. He had been promised 9 howitzers to provide the heavy fire needed to breach the stone walls. Without a word, Pendleton, a man who proved himself utterly inadequate to the logistics of the field, redirected 4 or 5 of those guns. A.P. Hill, with 65 guns under his command, used none of them effectively. Ewell's corps, perfectly positioned to enfilade the Union line, sent only 1 of 5 battalions into action. It was a catastrophic failure of centralized command. The symphony of destruction Alexander had planned turned into a discordant, uncoordinated mess. The moment finally arrived. The silence fell over the field, heavy and expectant. 12,500 men stood ready, their bayonets gleaming in the afternoon sun. Alexander, his heart hammering against his ribs, realized the bombardment had failed. The ammunition was running dangerously low. He had to make a choice. He pulled out a piece of paper and scribbled a note to General Pickett. He told him the truth. His ammunition was low, the enemy fire was still deadly, and if they were going to do this, they had to move now. There was no room left for delay. The stillness that followed the cessation of the fire was not a relief, it was an agonizing, suffocating vacuum. The air hung heavy, filled with the metallic tang of spent iron and the ghostly, drifting veils of white smoke that clung to the tall grass like a shroud. Alexander stood motionless, his eyes sweeping across the mile of open ground that the infantry would soon have to cross, a distance that suddenly looked less like a battlefield and more like a graveyard in the making. In that frozen heartbeat of silence, he could hear nothing but the frantic, irregular hammering of his own heart, a stark contrast to the deadly quiet of the field. He stared at the men waiting in the tree line, men he knew by name, men whose families he had shared meals with, and he felt the crushing weight of their imminent erasure. His hand trembled almost imperceptibly as he gripped the scrap of paper, his mind warring between the cold, rigid duty of an officer and the soul-sickening realization that he was about to sign a death warrant for thousands of souls who trusted him to lead them to victory. He handed the note to the courier. He watched as the message was delivered. He watched as Pickett rode to Longstreet to ask for the order to charge. The orders came down from above, a machine already set in motion, impossible to stop. Alexander watched his friends, his comrades, the men he had trained and supplied, walk out into that open field. He knew. Before they even stepped off, he knew. The weight of that knowledge was his alone to carry. Roughly 6,000 men fell in an hour. It was the turning point. It was the moment the Confederate offensive capability in the East was effectively broken. But Alexander didn't walk away. He didn't fade into the silence of defeat. He spent the next 30 years in the quiet of his study writing the military memoirs of a Confederate. While others were busy building the mythology of the lost cause, painting Lee as a saint and the defeat as an act of noble fate, Alexander was dismantling the lies. He systematically documented every decision, every failure, every broken link in the chain. He did not spare Lee. He did not spare Stuart. He did not spare Pendleton. He attached numbers to the incompetence. He brought the cold, hard science of an artilleryman to the history of the war, refusing to let the truth be buried under the weight of nostalgia.
At the time, the lost cause was being meticulously engineered by Southern intellectuals and former generals who sought to transform the Confederacy's defeat into a sacred, romantic martyrdom. They spun a narrative that cast Robert E. Lee not as a man capable of strategic error, but as a saint-like figure who could do no wrong, suggesting that the South had been defeated only by the overwhelming industrial brute force of the North, rather than by its own internal failures. By insisting on this mythic perfection, these apologists were actively erasing the hard, ugly lessons of the battlefield. Alexander's memoirs stood as a radical, jarring act of defiance against this tide. He understood that by painting Lee as infallible, the South was doomed to repeat the same catastrophic mistakes. He chose to stand alone against the consensus, valuing the cold, brutal truth of the math over the comfort of a comfortable national lie. Alexander did not write these accounts from the safety of a detached perspective. He had been 28 years old on that ridge. He had personally held the signal flag. For him, the pages of his memoir were not a detached academic exercise. They were an act of penance. He was meticulously cataloging the specific, preventable errors that he himself had been forced to facilitate. He was trying to explain why the impossible had happened. He believed that Gettysburg wasn't won by Union brilliance, but that it was lost by Confederate blindness. He believed that when commanders stop communicating, when they stop coordinating, and when they simply assume someone else is handling the hard work, failure is the only possible outcome. He was the man who fired the signal. He was the man who watched the smoke clear to reveal the carnage he had helped facilitate. His words don't come from a place of academic observation. They come from the front line of a mistake that changed the world. Alexander believed the outcome of that day was not inevitable. He believed it was a choice. Do you agree? Did the Confederates lose the battle because of their own internal collapse, or was the Union position already too strong to be taken? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if this is the kind of history they left out of the textbooks, you know where to find it.